I'm going to do a couple of things with the session this afternoon. There is a brand new policy set by the U.S. government dealing with the kidnapping of American citizens, and that certainly affects any church here that's sending missionaries short-term or long-term. How many of you send people out on trips, short-term trips? Okay, you all need to know this then. And I want to save a little bit of time then just for some follow-up questions, because we really pushed through the terrorism section, if there's any other questions about that. And we want to keep you in the icebox as long as we can. So, anyway, so I started doing hostage negotiations in the international environment in 1986. Had no idea what I was doing, but nobody else did either, so it was okay. We kind of learned together. But in the season between 1986 and probably about 3 years ago, this would describe generally the experience that I had and the churches and faith-based organizations I worked with had with the U.S. government in all of its manifestations. Top one is inconsistency. I mean, from one case to another, from one embassy to another, from one year to another, there was absolutely no predicting what would happen. Things that were routine requests in one place were insurmountable in another place. Bureaucracies and silos. The 9/11 Commission report really talked about those, but that was the issue as well. And stress and tension between United States government agencies. That's the politically correct way of saying that the FBI and the State Department could not share the same space, didn't work together very well, hardly at all. And there was a reason, well, there are multiple reasons for that, I suppose, but part of it was there was legislation, federal legislation, that appeared to give the State Department priority in being the lead agency of the U.S. government responsible for kidnapping cases of Americans overseas. And, of course, there was legislation that also gave the FBI the same responsibility. They never really got deconflicted, as the wonderful term we use, but the two agencies literally struggled with each other, and of course, the hostages, their families, their churches or sending organizations, and the people trying to get them out were the ones that really kind of paid the price. And then the other thing was the government, in all of its agencies and forms, didn't understand us. When I say us, I mean people who were motivated by their faith to go overseas into dangerous places and sometimes get into trouble. I used to, when teaching classes to missionaries, I'd put it this way. When you go to Washington and you talk to somebody about a missionary, or any faith-based worker, their image is the people who couldn't get a real job, dress funny, go overseas, and then call us for help. That was kind of the perception. Now, not everywhere, but it really was. And when you peeled away some of the layers and looked at it, it's a very different worldview. If you're talking about the worldview of the State Department, for example, it doesn't include a lot of faith-based elements to it. Same with the FBI. So there was this lack of understanding of who we are and why we're in places where the State Department says you probably shouldn't go. So that was what it kind of looked like, and it was very. Some of the cases we worked, we had outstanding cooperation from the FBI. A couple of cases we worked, we had outstanding cooperation from an ambassador or embassies. And others, there are no words to describe how bad it was. And you just couldn't tell case by case. Some of this came to a head in 2014. James Foley, the first American journalist beheaded by ISIS. His mother, Diane, who's someone now I've come to know pretty well, we both support another organization. She's a classy lady. But it was her son. And ISIS is holding her son and threatening to kill him, and she's going to do everything she can to get him out. And ISIS demanded a $200 million ransom. Frankly, that amount was set because It was unreachable. It was not negotiable. I think everybody knew that, but his mother's going to try. And while she was doing that and working with different agencies of the United States government, she was told in a meeting that if you send any money to ISIS, or even try to send any money to ISIS, you've committed a federal felony and you can be prosecuted. And well, we hit with drones. And about 4 months after we hit the camp, President Obama announced that Weinstein was in the camp and he was killed accidentally. And there'd been a lot of work go on, intelligence work, and the government was erroneously, but was convinced in good faith there were no hostages in the camp. So when that happened, Weinstein's family disclosed that they actually paid a ransom. It was about $600,000 to the Taliban with the assistance of the FBI. And we were, wait a minute, what's going on here? And the FBI said, yes, we did. That's what the family wanted to do, and we helped them. And one of the technicalities is to violate the statute that Diane Foley was threatened with, it has to be a designated terrorist group, one of the ones that's designated by one of the agencies of the U.S. government. And most of the Taliban is not, which is also one of the reasons the government gave for the trade of Bergdahl for 5 Gitmo prisoners. Didn't violate our policies and our laws on how we deal with terrorists. Anyway, so we have this situation where Weinstein, a ransom was paid, the FBI helped pay it. Foley, no ransom was paid, and the U.S. government threatened to prosecute the mother for doing the same thing that had just helped Weinstein do. I think that was really the tipping point. The president's press secretary, I don't care what party, they got to have the worst job in the world, because he's trying to explain this and in this conflict, and the press is all over him on April 30th, and he finally says, look, here's the deal. Helping with a ransom payment, to use your word, is not tantamount to paying a ransom. That was our policy. That was our policy. It made pretty much no sense at all. Yeah. So now I'm going to tell you a story, though, about things that do work okay in the government. President Obama, who I didn't vote for, okay, but President Obama ordered a top-to-bottom review of U.S. hostage policy because of these cases and a couple others that came up like it. Other families came out. Oh, by the way, the FBI also said, and with Diane Foley, we were in the room when the State Department threatened to prosecute her. It did happen. It was a senior State Department official. It was one guy. He's a 30-year veteran, kind of a crusty guy, I hear. Had served on the National Security Council and was philosophically opposed to the payment of ransom, believed that to be the right policy, and believed the law was behind him. But anyway, it created quite a mess. But the president ordered a top-to-bottom review of how the U.S. government handles the kidnapping of American citizens, non-official American citizens, overseas. And he assigned the National Counterterrorism Center that task to conduct the study, which was a wise move because the NCTC doesn't have any skin in the game. They're not an operational unit. They provide intelligence support to the agencies, but they don't get involved in recovery or negotiations or anything like that. And actually the lead investigator, the lead researcher for the project was a general by the name of General Sokolik, an Army 3-star general. The guy's like 1,000 feet tall. Just a really squared away, sharp guy. And he ran a no-nonsense study. The government approached, or they actually contacted every family of an American hostage for the past 20 years, and every surviving American hostage for the past 20 years, and asked them to be part of the study, or the review and the study. They also reached out to, I think it was 6 governments, friendly governments, the ones you'd expect, Germany, England, Israel, France, Canada, and I think Australia was the sixth government to be part of the study. And then finally, they talked to about a half a dozen what they call subject matter experts. And I got a call one day asking to be one of the subject matter experts for hostage negotiations. And I asked them why me, and they said, you're the only one we can find that doesn't get paid for doing it, so you have no financial stake in it. It's okay, but it was a really interesting experience, and I want to share some of it with you so you have the government gets it right sometimes, let's put it this way. So this is an independent study being run by the NCTC to give whatever recommendations it feels appropriate to the president for action. At the same time, in Congress, there are two bills being passed or being pushed, one by a Democrat, one by a Republican, and both of them say about the same thing, that we want to create a new federal agency with a hostage czar to run all this stuff. It was going to be like a cabinet-level agency with a czar. One of them also wanted to promote kinetic resolutions as the option of choice. And that one I couldn't resist. That was by the California congressman. So I called his office at one point and said, talked to the guy who wrote it, who sounded like he was like 13 years old or something. And I said, what do you mean when you say kinetic options? Well, kinetic. No, I'm asking you, what do you mean? Well, it's using force and stuff. I mean, are you talking about hostage rescues? He goes, yeah. I said, okay, just a word of advice. It's only the movie people that say kinetic. None of the operators say that kind of stuff. But this was legislation that was going to try to push American policy in one-size-fits-all direction. So these were bad ideas. And of course, has anybody ever seen a problem get better when we add a layer of federal bureaucracy on top of everything else? So those were bad ideas. But there was a momentum towards elevating hostage rescue from an option of last resort, because it's the most dangerous option, to an option of first resort. Because when it works, it works well. So this process went through, people were interviewed, interviews back and forth. They interviewed me a couple of times, and I had written a paper about a negotiation experience that I'd had working closely with the FBI. There'd been an American journalist held in Somalia. He was independent. He had no structure behind him at all. His mother was his crisis management team and his insurance company and his bank and his negotiator. I mean, for 2 years, she was 69 when he was taken. This 69-year-old lady was the only one talking to his kidnappers, and she kept him alive for a couple of years. But she's talking to Somali Muslim pirates, and it was never going to go anywhere. So I got involved with the request of the government. We negotiated, transferred the negotiations to me, but working really close with the FBI, and it was the first time I'd worked that close with them. It really worked well. It was a system, it was a relationship that worked well. And then after that, there was another missionary case in Nigeria, and by then the FBI was testing the concept of a fusion cell. And I think most of you probably know what a fusion cell is, but the idea is you get everybody working on the same problem issue where they come to the same place. They don't go work at state and FBI and defense and all over Washington. They come to one room, they work together, they get to know each other, they share information, and it's worked well in a number of areas. It's certainly worked well in narcotics enforcement, it's worked well in domestic terrorism, and the FBI was sensing that this was probably something that was going to happen, was trying it out. And this case that happened in Nigeria was the first time they'd actually used their version of the fusion cell. And it worked out as well. So I wrote a paper about that, why I recommended that be the model. But there was a lot of push towards this hostage czar. And after my first interview, I had a chance to speak to General Sikolik about it. He called me and wanted to have some other ideas, and we talked about it and pushed really hard for the fusion cell model. And ultimately, after 8.5 months, this study group of the NCTC came up with 24 recommendations. And they're all available. You can look at all of them online. They're all at whitehouse.gov. And presented 24 recommendations to the president. Of those, I was fully supportive of about 20 of them. 2 I didn't like very much, but they're okay. And 1 was just it didn't really apply. So this looked like good stuff to me. The president accepted and put into well, the force of law by President's directives, 24 of 24 recommendations he received, and he didn't modify one of them. So he let the experts work on it. They came up with a good product, a good outcome, and he enacted it. The NCTC invited everybody who'd been involved in the study to come to Washington for a rollout session where they could explain everything, take questions, and then the next day the families and the hostages all got to go to the White House and be part of the signing ceremony with the president. But at the rollout session, there's a room, it was very much about the same numbers. And most of them were hostage families and hostages, a few of us who'd been involved in the study. But an extraordinary thing happened that I think it's important to share because it's pretty easy for us to take swipes at the government. I'm right at the top of doing that. But the meeting was chaired by Jen Easterly, who is I gotta get this right, the assistant. It's on my slide somewhere. Thank you. See, I never follow this stuff. Special assistant to the president and the senior director for counterterrorism, who meets the president every day. She managed to get that in several times. She chaired it. This is a high-level position. You probably see her name and other stuff. So she got up and began the meeting. She's speaking on behalf of the White House. She's speaking primarily to the families of American hostages, families of hostages who died, families of hostages who are still being held, and to release hostages. And what she said was, ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to tell you that your government failed you. And then CIA got up, state, defense, and the FBI all got up and said the same thing. They said basically some of the things that are going to come up in the slides here. And it was an extraordinary meeting. Now, it didn't make everybody buddy-buddy, and it didn't satisfy everybody in the audience, but it was, I thought, an extraordinary moment to have the government deal with a group of its citizens who had failed and fess up to it. It was something to behold. I talked to General Sokolik afterwards, and I just asked him. He's been in the uniformed service for 34 years. And I said, you really had no pressure. He said, we had pressure from Congress that we got to ignore. We had absolutely no pressure from the White House. And he said, I asked him, I said, you did 24 recommendations, no pushback on any of them. He said, no. He said it was literally one of the most extraordinary things he'd done in government service, outside of actual military, combat things, which he's done. It was just something that kind of made you proud. But let me take you through a little bit 5 foreign governments. This is what the review team said they heard. And you have these slides, and these slides are actually the ones from the meeting. Hostage recovery didn't seem to be a priority to these families. And boy, you can go right down the line, and most of them, that's exactly what they said. That's a polite way of saying the government didn't care. The government didn't care. They didn't know who to contact, they didn't know who was responsible, and they got conflicting information. They felt that the government took their trust for granted, and they felt that the families felt in return that they were not trusted by the government. And I think that's a very accurate observation. The families didn't trust the expertise of the government, and many of the families felt that they had more information from their own sources about these events than the government did. Diane Foley talked about that a lot. She said she'd have these regular meetings with the FBI and defense and the other agencies, and they're asking her, what have you heard? What do you know? And she'd say, well, we've heard about this, and they'd ask her for all kinds of information. And I can tell you that that's not uncommon. And frankly, most of the time that's not a factor. That's not because the agencies don't know what to do, and it's usually the FBI. It's because ambassadors and politicians don't let the FBI go out and do their work. I've handled a number of kidnapping cases where by the time I get there to be the negotiator, no one's gone to the scene, no one's interviewed witnesses, no one's collected evidence, and so I say, well, I'm going, you guys want to come along, and the ambassador won't let FBI agents go. It's kind of crazy. So they have their hands tied behind their back. These are conclusions that the review team presented to the families and to the president. U.S. policy was outdated and inconsistent with today's hostage cases and the threat environment. And in speaking about that, they said we were about 20 years behind, and that's probably a pretty fair observation. Unclear roles and responsibilities, a need for recovery strategies tailored to specific cases, and inconsistent collaboration and information flow. These are pretty significant things for a government to say, we got wrong. So what did they do? These are the major steps that happened. This is now U.S. policy. It's found in presidential findings and presidential security directives, some of which is classified, most of it isn't. But there's a fusion cell, and so far, it seems to be working okay. The fusion cell is housed at the FBI headquarters and is staffed primarily by FBI agents. So all the support and all that occurs from the FBI. One of the provisions I wasn't thrilled about is that the leadership of the fusion cell will rotate between the FBI, state, and defense. And I talked to Sokolic and to the FBI senior agent who's in charge, and so that really sounds like a political decision to me, and they didn't deny that, but it's still better than it was. They established a family engagement team, so there's a new unit that works in the fusion cell that is its only job is to meet with families, to be the information link between families and the U.S. government. And the leader of that group, I can't remember her job title now, they specifically went outside the government and they hired a woman who has worked for the International Red Cross for about 15 years doing victims issues internationally and brought her in. They went outside the government to bring someone in with experience dealing with families in these kind of cases. And so far, the reports have been very good. I've been at a couple of conferences speaking with her. She seems very much committed to the work. Of course, we had to get some political things, so there's a response group at the White House. This is not a hostage czar, it's just an advisory group to the White House. There is a special presidential envoy for hostage affairs. One of the things that happened with the fusion cell and the new policy, much of the State Department's role was taken away and given to the FBI. Anything dealing with the hostages, their families, communicating with hostages, communicating with families, all of that has left the State Department and is now the responsibility of the FBI through the fusion cell. Of course, that's kind of a big deal politically. They did establish this new position. This is an ambassador-level position, and his role or her role is to represent the fusion cell and the United States if there's anything that requires state-to-state, nation-to-nation communication about hostages. A good example where this would have been really helpful, the last 2 years ago now, almost 2 years ago, a South African missionary, Pierre Corky, was being held by AQAP in Yemen, and he was being held with an American journalist named Luke Summers. And it was not clear that they were being held together until the U.S. tried to rescue Summers. They launched a rescue attempt for him, and they had bad intelligence, and Summers had been moved 3 days before the operation. But they did rescue a number of Yemeni soldiers, government soldiers who were being held hostage. But then the government realized that, well, now we've tipped our hand. We need to find Summers and mount another rescue operation as quick as we can before he's killed. And that operation obviously was laid on quickly. They did find the location. They attempted another rescue in a short period of time, not nearly as long as a hostage rescue force would like to have eyes on before they do the rescue. And there was some missed intelligence about a dog, frankly, and it was a dog barking that kind of tipped off AQAP, Al-Qaeda, that they were coming in. So the engagement began outside the camp instead of inside the camp, left one guy enough time to run into the hut where Summers and it turns out Pierre Corky were being held, and he shot and killed them both. There was tremendous tension, and there still is, between the governments of the United States, South Africa, and Britain was involved as well in some ways I probably shouldn't talk about. And it would have been very helpful to officials, a congressman or a senator, and have them try to do it. And things are always better when you have elected officials helping you, right? Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But this was a lot of what the study group heard and a lot of what they presented back to the president. So there is this family engagement unit. The families, and this is an interesting policy change that will affect you if any one of your people are ever taken hostage, and as a church or part of a sending agency, you have to deal with this. The family has been given now a place of priority in the decision-making about how the government may respond to the kidnapping. What does that mean, you say? Here's the first example. Families are being asked by the U.S. government very early on if they will approve a military rescue if the opportunity comes up. Let's think about that. So you're a family, and a typical family in one of your churches. It's a short-term worker out there and get caught up in something, they're being held. And within a day or two of finding out, the family gets a visit, probably by an FBI agent and someone from the military, to pose that question. The question is, if we have the opportunity, will you authorize us? It's almost like giving us permission, but will you authorize us to conduct a rescue attempt? That sounds like a no-brainer, right? The reality is, it's an incredibly complicated question that the families at that point probably don't have the background to answer. They need to know, for example, that 85% of all hostages who die in captivity die when someone comes to rescue them, tries to rescue them. 85% of all hostage deaths. The top teams in the world, there's 3 or 4 countries with the top teams, and the United States is one of them. And in, George, you might holler at me if I get the statistic wrong, but I think it's in 46 or 47% of hostage rescue attempts by U.S. Special Forces in the past 10 years, there's been at least one fatality. Doesn't mean all the hostages were killed, but at least one. It's dangerous for the best teams. And those of you that have had any exposure, those of you that have been involved in SWAT, you know what you need to do a hostage rescue. I mean, you need the kind of intelligence that is just really hard to get. It's not that he's in this village. It's the hostage is in this village, and he's staying in this hut, not that one, this one, and he's guarded at night by this many people, and this many of them are outside, and this many are inside, and he sleeps in this corner, and the guards sleep in the other corners, and this is what he wears. And I mean, without information intelligence at that kind of level, the odds of a successful rescue just keep going down because it's just incredibly difficult to do. And yet a family's going to be asked to give their blessing without knowing any of this detail. I think it's a little selfish, frankly, on the part of the government, but they want to be able to say, well, the family knew about it. And I also think there's a good faith effort to involve the families in the decisions. Those were actions that, up until this new policy, typically were brought to the employer or the sending agency. That would be you guys in the case of churches. And now it's unclear what role we'll have. You can be supporting the family. If the family wants you involved, then there'll be a place at the table for you. But it's a whole different world out there. I think I've covered those things. Family engagement. One of the other big things that the government has promised to do is declassify information for families. There was this long, heated exchange at the rollout meeting between families and some of the government people that said, "You never told us anything. We told you everything." It was a one-way street with information. And we know what that feels like, some of us. It's a one-way street with information. And then sometimes the government would say, well, we have information, but we can't tell you about it because of classification issues. And oftentimes, whoever the families were meeting with were trapped. The government representatives they were talking to, usually the FBI agents, were trapped by classifications that somebody else had placed on information. And if you kind of know how that system works, once somebody puts top secret on it, unless you have your own private email server at your house, you're not supposed to read it. I couldn't resist. I went almost all day. Okay. But if that's what you've got, if you're an FBI agent liaising with a family and it's the classification of the information doesn't let you do it, you can't share it with them. And most of the time, you guys know as well, classification has very little to do with the information. It has to do with sources and methods. And the families don't care about that. They just want to know what we know. And it's a real tension. So part of the change, one of the recommendations is that there will be, and I don't know this term, but the term was described, I'm driving Chuck crazy by walking around, I'm sorry, as declassifiers. And there's actually going to be a new exemption for information that can't be formally declassified. There's going to be an exemption to read in family members in things that they didn't get before. And I think that's going to be a huge improvement. Just so family members have some trust that the government does know what it's doing. And oftentimes, the government knew more than the families ever knew because they just weren't allowed to say because of classification. And then this part of the organization is supposed to, the fusion cell, is supposed to develop relationships with all of the third parties, employers or sending organizations, outside hostage negotiators, insurance companies, all those people as well that get involved. This is an area we're still having some discussion with. I've put my input into the group that as a negotiator, I need to be dealing with operational people, not with family engagement people. There needs to be a crossover, and I think they're working on it. This was partly a situation where the pendulum had swung so far away from supporting families, and it was way over on this side of just treating families badly, that when they fixed it, like so many times, the pendulum swung way back over, and it needs to find a balance, and that'll probably take a little bit of time. So these are the policy statements that the NCTC recommended to the President, and the President adopted as the policy of the United States government in dealing with these hostage cases. The government's committed to achieving the safe and rapid recovery of U.S. nationals taken hostage and will leverage every appropriate resource in a coordinated effort to recover hostages. And it affirms that it may work with anybody, basically, to locate and recover American hostages. The policy is, though, to deny hostage takers the benefits of ransom, prisoner releases, policy changes, or other acts of concession. Hold that thought. And I'm going to skip the indented bullet. Let's come down to the endeavor to work closely with the hostage family, blah, 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 to share as much information, mindful of the need to protect the safety of the hostage, the integrity of recovery efforts, any ongoing criminal investigation, and intelligence sources and methods. And that is the government saying diplomatically that there may be higher priorities that have to be considered. There may be other priorities that have to be considered. Now, this is becoming a very controversial part of the policy. When I was asked by the FBI to help this mother with her son being held by Somali pirates, I asked, well, how are the negotiations being done? And they said, well, she's doing them. That got my attention because that's really not a great idea. But there wasn't anybody else to do it. She had determined, well, first of all, Somali pirates care about one thing only, and that's money. So without a ransom payment, the chances of any other negotiated resolution are about zero. So that means there would have to be a rescue. Pretty hard to do in Somalia. There have been some that were successful, but it wasn't on the table in this case. This particular hostage is a dual national, German-American. He was, although a freelance journalist, he was on an assignment for Der Spiegel when he was taken. And quietly behind the scenes, the German government informed the American government that a large amount of money would be made available for a ransom payment. Plus, the mother had already done what mothers do. She had cleaned out all her bank accounts, done everything she could, and come up with a lot of money for her. And there was obviously, that was the direction of the negotiations, was to pay a ransom. There were considerations of a rescue the entire time. They got close on one occasion, but an event happened that took it off the table. But so anyway, Marlis, that's her name. Marlis is talking to the pirates, and I asked the FBI, I said, well, why aren't you guys doing it? Well, we can't because they're going to pay a ransom. I said, but you're sitting there coaching her, right? No, we can't do that because she's going to pay a ransom. We can brief her ahead of time, we can debrief her afterwards, but we can't sit there and help her. I said, okay. And I said, who's translating for her? An FBI linguist. So I looked at the agents and I said, so you guys can't tell her what to say and how to say it, but you guys, the FBI, can translate. And this is about the time they drew down and threatened to shoot me for trying to make sense of the policies that were totally restricting them as well. And this was how hard it was, but some of this is still in place. The new policy says that the U.S. government can help private parties negotiate ransoms. That's what it says. That was misinterpreted by the press as saying now the U.S. government can negotiate ransoms, which the U.S. government claimed it has never done, and that's not true. Let's see. Okay. So, this is a slide that was presented at the rollout meeting by an assistant U.S. Attorney General who had been part of the group, and he presented this slide, and he's got the fun job of talking about this most controversial piece where Diane Foley and others were threatened with prosecution by their government. And he said, this is not policy. This is his presentation. In instances where hostage takers are part of a terrorist group, there's been some concern expressed by families about potential prosecutions. And here it is. The Department of Justice does not intend to add to families' pain in such cases by suggesting that they could face criminal prosecution, which the Department of Justice didn't need to do because the State Department had done it. And then it went on to say, perhaps the best indication of how DOJ will exercise its prosecutorial discretion is the record. The Department of Justice has never used the material support statute to prosecute a family for paying a ransom for the safe return of their loved one. This language is not in the presidential findings or the PPD. This language was in a PowerPoint presentation by an assistant U.S. attorney. When it came time for question and answer, I asked the question. And I told him, I said, I don't understand why this, which is one of the most controversial things that's happened, is the only thing that the government is presenting that doesn't have the force of the president making it law behind it. It has the force of a PowerPoint presentation. And the families were they got some applause for making that statement. And the attorney who's, he's got the bad job of defending U.S. policy he probably doesn't agree with, said, no, look, we would never do this. We would never prosecute a family. You threatened to prosecute a family. No, in our discretion, we will never exercise our right to do this. Okay, many people in this room are a little bit suspicious about prosecutorial discretion and intentions because it can change. And we can think, I can create a hypothetical situation that doesn't impute any evil to the U.S. government where some family does something that's so over the top the government does decide they're going to prosecute. I mean, we all know discretion is one thing. So the issue of paying ransom is not as clear as the media portrayed it out of this case. And that may certainly come up, again, if you're in church leadership, if you're a pastor, if you're involved where someone from your church has been taken and these issues come up, I guarantee you families will want to pay the ransom. The statements are all made, does not intend to add to families' pain by suggesting they could face criminal prosecutions. The best indication of how DOJ is going to proceed is they've never prosecuted a family for paying ransom. And that's correct. They've done one prosecution under this statute that involved the payment of a ransom for an American citizen held by Somali pirates. They prosecuted the negotiator. So there was some indication that the negotiator was probably a principal with the kidnappers, and it may not have been. It may have been the right thing to do. It's hard to tell. I asked the FBI agents when they asked me to be involved in this large ransom negotiation. I said, "What about the statute?" And they said, "Don't worry, Somali pirates aren't designated terrorists." And I said, "Yes, but we all know that 40% of every ransom Somali pirate gets goes to Al-Shabaab, which is, and that triggers the statute." And they said, "Oh yeah, you're right." And basically, everybody's working without a net. And it's just something we have to know. I think the more people with federal badges that tell you it's okay to do it, probably the better off we are, but we need to have eyes open. That this part of the policy is not clear, and we have the statement of intent by the Department of Justice, as opposed to a presidential finding which has the force of law until this president or another president changes it. Does that make sense? I don't know if it makes sense, but is it kind of clear that it doesn't make any sense? Thank you. My work here is done. I've confused the audience. Chuck, we're going home. So I want to talk a little bit about some analysis of this and what it means for the faith-based community, because it has some real implications for us. Overall, this is, I think, going to be a much better situation. The Fusion Cell has not dealt with a case involving an American missionary or faith-based worker or church worker yet. But it'll happen. It'll happen fairly soon. But several of the people that were kind of involved in this have been at different conferences like this one together, and I've been at those and spoke with the agent who's in charge, Michael Moriarty, who's in charge of the Fusion Cell. I'm sorry, McGarity, who's in charge of the Fusion Cell. And this is a squared-away, level-headed guy, and I think that the Fusion Cell is going to try and do exactly what the policies say it's going to do. I'm not sure that a presidential mandate that says everybody's going to play in the sandbox well together has immediately solved that. There's still tension between state and the FBI. I think the state is concerned that a lot of their authority was taken away, and we'll see how that plays out. But this is certainly a much, much improved situation than the chaos we've had for the 30 years before that. Churches, sending organizations, families, will be working much more with the FBI than the State Department. Now, I came out of local law enforcement, so a city police department, and you guys know the jokes. I mean, we would say that we would call the FBI when we needed someone to take credit for our work, and they would say we'd call the local cops when we need someone to mess up the scene, and I mean, all that tension. But the reality is the FBI knows what they're doing in these cases. I've had the opportunity to work with a number of people from the Critical Incident Response Group in Quantico. These are top-notch negotiators, top-notch support people. Their victim service people are absolutely top-notch. The people that will work with the families and then will also help with debriefing and reintegration of hostages, unless there was some other really well-oiled option for that. Even though there's not going to be a faith-based component, that can be added in by the organization. I would use the FBI for the initial debriefing and reintegration process. The people in it are really good and they really care about what they're doing. The family's role is substantially changed. And whether as a church we are directly involved because we're part of the sending group, or whether we're supporting the family, the family's under one kind of stress when they're sitting kind of waiting for people to tell them what's happening, which has kind of been the model, to now they're being briefed more and asked questions like, what about a rescue? Those are heavy, heavy decisions. And so the families are going to need our support more. Cautions and challenges. And one of the big cautions and challenges that's going to come up is this presumption that the family's the primary decision maker, not the employer or the sending agency. But the U.S. government Getting the government involved in some of these cases in the past 30 years required an act of Congress and dynamite, it seemed like, to blast people out and to get them involved. Now the government is saying very, very specifically, and if you want to go pull the documents online from whitehouse.gov, you can look at them, that it's going to have a first responder kind of role. And in fact, after the meetings, one of the things my organization does is we put out briefing material. I wanted to do something for the mission community on this, and I wanted to use that term first responder. And I called the NCTC and asked them, I just want to know if I'm using the term properly. I don't want to use the term and have you guys say, no, that isn't right. And Sokolik told me, he called me back and he told me, we're going to send that question to the White House and let them answer, which I thought was a bit strange. And so an appointment was made for me to speak to Easterly again, and she called and we spoke. She said, so Bob, what's your question? And have different priorities and objectives than the government does. I'll share with you a couple of stories, true stories from hostage negotiations that my organization has been involved in to kind of illustrate that. In one case, in the Philippines, missionaries were taken hostage, and the government really, really wanted to take over the negotiations from the sending agency. And it had a lot of political reasons. Some of it had to do with negotiations to get Clark and Subic, the two U.S. military bases, back. Just a lot of things going on. And they put a lot of pressure on the families. And finally, they put the pressure on the families so much the families said to the mission agency, look, let's let the government do this. And so we stepped back. And the government took over the negotiations. We had been negotiating by radio with the kidnappers. The Abu Sayyaf group, still around. And the government took over, but continued to pose as missionaries. Okay, that's not okay. But that's what happened. The government informed us that the ransom demand at that point was about $182,000. And the government was indicating they were going to pay that. And we're still having consultations, and we found out who they were going to pay, and we told them, no, that's the wrong guy. Don't pay him. I mean, we don't think anybody should be paid, but don't pay this guy. This is the cousin of the kidnappers. And the government said to us, what do you think they said to us missionaries? We know best. We've got stuff in the sky. We know best. And we said, no, we've been down there, and you haven't, because the ambassador won't let you go down. And that was the case. They hadn't had people down on the ground, but we knew for sure that the guy they wanted to pay was the wrong guy. And we'd been talking to the right people and doing all the things in negotiation. You can't raise this kind of money. It's a big problem and all that. And with the change in negotiators, the government ultimately paid the wrong guy, the cousin. So we'd been telling the kidnappers there's no money. And then all of a sudden people saying they were us, remember they're posing as the missionary group's negotiators, say, or they give this money to the wrong guy, the cousin. That made things a lot worse. At some point after that, there was a meeting at the embassy, and we were told that there's now a new solution to the kidnapping case. And it was really presented with enthusiasm. And I want to, the FBI negotiators who are working this, these are good people. They are sharp people, but they are working for the government from the government's perspective, and they don't share our worldview. And the solution was, we're going to get the hostages out by agreeing that all the missionaries leave the southern half of the Philippines. And we said, what do you mean all the missionaries? All the missionaries from this group? No, all the missionaries. Every Christian missionary in the southern Philippines is going to leave? Yeah. And why wouldn't you want to do that? Because they're kidnapping and killing you. I mean, this, from the government's perspective, this looked like a great deal. And in the meeting, when we're all saying, absolutely not, there was no comprehension on the part of other people. Why would you say no? And it ended up a long process involved putting together a white paper that went to the National Security Council to kind of say why this wasn't okay and the mission community wouldn't support it. And again, the people trying to get the hostages out thought they had come up with the golden answer. No ransom. We won't do that again. We'll get the hostages out and missionaries will be safe. And that's just a different worldview. You may remember in 2009, I think, a church in South Korea sent a team to Afghanistan of 22 people from the church. The team was kidnapped by a Taliban faction, and there was a demand for an exchange with 5 prisoners. That demand was refused. The Taliban killed the mission pastor and the lay leader of the mission team, and then continued in negotiations. And ultimately, a ransom of about $22 million was paid to the Taliban. $22 million, and that wasn't the big part of the problem. The Korean and Afghan governments agreed to withdraw every Korean citizen in Afghanistan who was there as a missionary, and they did. They agreed not to allow Korean citizens to return to Afghanistan to do missions work. Now, to the government's credit, shortly after, within a couple of months after that, I think the government realized that there were a lot of problems with that. They reached out to the professional mission associations in Korea and did a lot of work in trying to repair that damage. And it's not a deal that they feel bound to keep, let me just put it that way. But this was a church team, and those kind of concessions send a message to not only the Taliban, but every other group out there. These groups all pay attention to each other, and what happens in one case affects what happens in other cases. And it's hard to describe what happens when the force of the U.S. government descends on a sending organization and a family, and that may well be a church. More and more churches are acting as their own sending organizations, or with short-term teams, you're the ones responsible. And I want you to imagine having some pretty senior government officials coming in saying, well, this is what we think we should do, and these are the decisions that have to be made, and you're saying to your government, we're not going to do that. Or it's a pretty intense situation. I think it's going to work out a little better, but the government is asserting its authority to act unilaterally, not in concert or in agreement or consultation with the employer or the sending agency. We've talked about this. Now, one of the things that is a factor facing us as well is that families are going to have the lead with the U.S. government. How many of you in church leadership have sent someone to be a missionary, someone's gone out to be a missionary, either short-term, long-term, it doesn't matter, and that person is a believer, but the family is not. And the family, in fact, is pretty much convinced you guys are a cult. And when something goes wrong and they get kidnapped, that's their proof. Right now, U.S. policy is that family gets to make the decisions, not the church or the sending agency, unless there's some way to demonstrate to the U.S. government, to its legal satisfaction, that that's not what the hostage wants. Most of the time, the next of kin is going to be pretty supportive, but you guys know families are messy. So that's an issue we're going to have to figure out how to work through with the government as well. Now, this is a nice new set of policies. We've asked what would have happened in the Pierre Corky, Luke Summers case. South African American, held by the same people. South African government and Corky's employers want a negotiation path followed. The U.S. government has decided in Summers' case it wants to do a rescue. These things still get very complicated. These new laws and procedures apply only to American hostages. And we see more and more cases where these are mixed. Our recommendations, after doing this for about 30 years with the government, is that if you're sending missionaries out, you need to be prepared to step in, and even as a local church, even if there's not a sending organization or a denominational mission board behind you, you're going to be face to face with a government that may want to do something that in its view is the best thing to do, but is completely inconsistent with our worldview. Removing all the missionaries. something like that. We found the government is comprised of people. And when you sit down and spend time with the individual people and you get to know them and you develop a relationship, you can make things proceed a lot better than taking shots from afar. The more you professionalize your response, the more you prioritize building relationships and being proactive with the FBI and with other elements of the government, the stronger position you'll be in to help influence the cases in a way that doesn't compromise the Great Commission ministry that we're all called to. The government has multiple interests in a hostage case. Let's face it. When an American citizen who's not a government employee is kidnapped, there are a lot of factors the government has to consider. Yes, for $200 million, we get a hostage out and save a life, but that's absolutely going to increase the chance of future kidnappings. If somebody grabs a missionary or a journalist and we open the prisons at Guantanamo, or we get Israel or France or any other nation to open their prisons, we've created precedent that's going to make the future kidnapping problem worse. So there are priorities that the government will have that may compete from time to time with the life of an individual hostage. And that sounds really bad to us, except that if you're involved in missions, the same applies to us. I don't know of any missionary who's gone out that would say, if I'm kidnapped and the price to get me out is to stop our work in a country, to shut down Great Commission ministry in a country, if it's my life or shutting down the ministry, I don't know anyone that's not going to say, don't let the ministry get shut down. I also don't know anyone who's going to say, if the demand is this, my life in exchange for the names of everybody who's trusted me and all the nationals I've worked with and new converts whose lives are absolutely at risk along with their families if their identities are disclosed, no missionary is going to say, make that trade for me. But that's foreign to our government. They don't understand that. So it's a partnership we have to be involved in. The more we're prepared to do that, the more we're prepared to sit down with government people and really represent Christ to them, the better it's going to go. I'll just close with a story from the 90s and the FARC in Colombia. The FARC was holding 5 American missionaries hostage and had been holding them for some time. The ambassador at the time, U.S. ambassador to Colombia, was Morris Busby, who had been the first American ambassador for counterterrorism, and then they sent him to Colombia. And if you're an ambassador and you have 5 Americans being held hostage by terrorists, that's a big deal. You're reporting almost every day to Washington. It dominates a lot of your time and attention and your resources. It's a big deal. Busby was very good. He was communicative. He shared information. He had country team meetings every Friday afternoon, and the crisis management team for these missionaries was always welcome to come to the country team meeting for the part of the discussion that dealt with hostages. He was very open about that. And it was a great working relationship, probably the best I've ever seen. And then a 6th missionary, American, gets kidnapped by the FARC. And the first meeting after he was kidnapped, we're there in the conference room in the embassy, and Ambassador Busby comes in, and there's maybe 3 or 4 of us from the crisis management teams in the 2 missions. And Busby, who is really a nice guy but has a temper as well, slams his fist down on the table, and he says, tell me why I shouldn't ask the Colombian government to revoke all of your missionaries and send all of your visas and send you home, because that's what they want me to do, that's what Washington wants me to do, and that's what I think I should do. Because there's now 6 missionaries being held. And there was one guy, Dan Gurman, who was on the high leadership team of New Tribes Mission, who this was like holding out the red cape to the bull. And he said, Mr. Ambassador, I'm glad you asked that question. Let me tell you why. And in about 3.5, 4 minutes, he gave a case for why Great Commission workers aren't going to leave. And to Ambassador Busby's credit, he listened, and at the end he said, okay. And that's the kind of influence that we can have on the government It's also the way we can make progress with them if we understand kind of how they're working and we're willing to work with them. We're willing to be proactive with them. This is going to face churches and denominational mission boards more and more because, as we talked about this morning, you are in the crosshairs. You are absolutely in the crosshairs. Kidnapping is one of the, even though it's not going to be at the high level of bombings, when they want to manipulate the press, when an organization wants to really put the screws to the host government, kidnapping people and torturing them or pretending to torture them in the media, all these kind of things these groups are very, very good at, or cutting their heads off on video is a tremendous tool. And this is going to be something we are going to be facing more and more for the foreseeable future, I think. So with that kind of concludes the discussion about the policy. I wanted to save a few minutes just to ask if there were any other questions, because we finished this morning really quick. So just any you have until Chuck gives me the high sign.
Robert, could you give a little comment on the Colorado Springs doctor that was taken hostage
Yeah, Dylan Joseph?
in Afghanistan?
Yeah.
And the other side of it, what's going on today with the
Talking about as far as numbers, which is a risky thing to do if you're a general, I think. But he said if the numbers come down to 15,000 or 18,000, whatever the administration was talking about at that time, we won't even have enough troops to do hostage rescues of American citizens. And then this case happens about 10 days later. And this case, I know that the kidnappers have been portrayed as the Taliban. This was a gang that was not. They weren't real experienced, they weren't real sharp. And it certainly was one that, and the doctor was incredibly, he was one of the brightest guys as a hostage I've ever dealt with. And he was thinking about rescue, and they were letting him talk. And so all that intelligence information I mentioned before, I mean, we knew exactly where he was. We knew exactly where he slept. We knew exactly how many guards there were. We knew exactly what he was wearing. I mean, all of the intel you could. And it just seemed like this was drawn up to be the perfect rescue case. And the perfect rescue cases are still dangerous. And the rescue begins, the outside guards are taken care of as the team comes through this is a typical little Afghan hut, an open door and, I don't know, maybe 140 square feet inside, something like that, and doctor's back in the corner. And one of the guards, as the team makes entry, wakes up, he's holding, as near as we can tell, he's holding the AK-47 on his chest, and he just involuntarily pulls the trigger and starts spraying. And the team leader caught around, under the chin where there's no armor and was killed. The hostage was rescued. It was a successful attempt, but it was one of those things where politics probably had too big a role. And I'm probably in trouble now, so I'll stop. The thing with Iran, we talked about that this morning. The government's going to, I think it's going to shake out that this payment was viewed by the administration as being something to help keep the treaty with Iran intact, to keep Iran from developing nuclear weapons. I don't know that many of us would agree with that, but I understand the argument. I think when you say it looks like a duck, it walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, but it really isn't a ransom. Anyway, and Chuck's going to cut me off, which he should. So,
Thank Bob.
thank you. Thanks, Chuck.